This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on the show, I have John Cochrane. He is the AQR Capital Management Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. We cover a wide territory today. Some in the audience will love our direction. Some will hate the direction. Either way, I hope you enjoy. So here's where I want to go, John. Digging through your blog, it's pretty easy to find topics that are near and dear to you. And something hit the news in the last couple weeks, couple months, and I've not read the book, but Tim Geithner had his book come out. And there was some press about one issue in there that I thought was interesting. And it was a comment or a discussion, a story about a conversation he had with Warren Buffett post the Bear bailout, I believe. But Buffett essentially told Geithner, hey, this is terrible. If you didn't do the bailout, it would have been terrible for the country, but I would have made a lot of money. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because if it would have been so terrible for the country, how would he have had the money to make the bets on buying the discounts? And I would love for you to kind of break that apart a little bit, because I thought that was a really telling comment, and it got a little bit of press, but I think it was the most famous American investor is basically saying, I would have made a fortune.
He's saying more than I would have made a fortune. He was saying he was in there ready to provide the private sector bailout instead of the government sector bailout. There's this story of there's no buyers, there's a fire sale, there's a spiral. If the government doesn't step in, it'll all fall apart. And there's Warren Buffett saying, no, I was ready to step in. It's just the price wasn't quite good enough yet for me. Your fire sale is my buying opportunity. And I think that just put the lie to the whole story of there's no one there willing to put in money to save these things on their own. The government has to do it. So it would have been great for the country. I don't know how Buffett judges that would have been bad for the country. The company would have been saved by Buffett instead of by the federal government, or the parts of the company that needed saving would have been saved, and we would have learned that private money can flow in these times. It would have been wonderful for the country had Buffett done that. Or Buffett also offered to bail out long-term to come in and buy up the pieces of long-term capital. When that was going under, and the government instead went in and did it itself.
You know what I find disingenuous about these bailouts when they happen is it's always positioned as, well, it's a special case scenario. It's not going to happen again. But I'm a pretty rational guy, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I see the banking sector is not doing so well, I don't want to hold positions in those banks. I don't want to own stock. But then you have to say to yourself, well, hold on, we're no longer dealing with market mechanisms here. We have to assume that there's a floor under the banks that just can't go any lower. It's kind of crazy.
They're right. Well, it's more than crazy. It's this problem. If the firehouse is too good, then nobody ever puts in fire extinguishers. And similar, so right, people buying bank stock understand that there's always this backstop from the government. Banks taking risks understand that there's always this backstop from the government. And the idea that it's just this one time and then it'll go away is exactly wrong. You're right. We started with long-term capital we started with Continental Illinois, which we bailed out. And then there was the savings and loan crisis, bailout. And then there's the tequila crisis, bailout. And then there's the Southeast Asian crisis, bailout. Then there was long-term capital, bailout. Then there was Bear Stearns. Well, we'll bail out Bear Stearns, and that will, of course, solve the whole problem, and we won't have any more of these, right? Ha, ha, ha.
One of the things that you pointed out there, you had linked to an article, and it was a fairly personal, it got into the policy of what he did, but it was a fairly personal attack of Geithner. And I liked what you did with that. You came back and you said, hold on, cronyism is a disease of government and polity which elects it, not supposed moral feelings of specific individuals. And you basically made the point like, hey, just going in for the personal attack doesn't really get us anywhere. And I think the point that you really make that I like is, hold on, who elects the politicians? At what point in time do the people take the blame for some of this?
Yeah, who elects the politicians? Who puts up with the whole system? In the end, Mr. Voter has to come up and object, and Mr. Newspaper Writer also. I mean, that's one of the great institutions that ferrets this sort of stuff out is the press. These in our country, but right to say that the solution to cronyism is that people like Geithner should turn down wonderful opportunities. It's like saying the problem with the economy is greed, or the problem with the political system is gridlock. Well, that's just not very productive.
Let me ask you also too, as we look back on the bailouts and some of observations, and I'm paraphrasing and shortening perhaps his version if I was talking with him, but Geithner basically said, hey, you have to put forth a wall of money, no strings attached, or all is lost. And I just don't know how thinking people can think. I mean, how did we get to that point? What has gone wrong? And is it even possible to fix when there's that much power in government to then reach into the capitalistic system and do things like that?
Well, let's give Mr. Geithner his due. Once a crisis has come and you're fighting the crisis, I think he's right. If you want to stop a run, you need a wall of money. Draghi found the same thing. There was a run going on in European sovereign debts. He wanted to stop it, and basically nothing was going to stop it. No scheme that said, well, we'll put in this much money, but no more. That wasn't going to stop it. You know, he had to say, we're going to print up as many euros as it takes, and we're going to buy up all this stuff, and that will calm the fires for now. What Geithner has forgotten about is moral hazard. He's forgotten about next time. He's forgotten about how do we set this up so we're not back in the same situation in a year or two from now. And that's the question you're asking, which is exactly the right question. And of course, there's the paradox. Yeah, only by pre-committing that you can't put up a wall of money next time will the private sector take the kind of care that you don't have to then turn around and put up the wall of money.
Yeah. You know, I saw a comment also from you. A good bear failure may have saved us from a bad Lehman failure. What did you mean by that?
Yes, suppose that Bear had been allowed to fail, and that Warren Buffett had been allowed to come in, buy up the pieces, make a ton of money on it. Bear Stearns, the operating parts of Bear Stearns would have gotten going. What the Fed wanted to do was send the message, hey guys, get ready. We're going to let one of these go under. Unfortunately, the message Wall Street got was, oh, everything's always going to be bailed out, don't worry about it. And I think letting Bear fail and having it work in the Warren Buffett way with some possible chaos, and people would have discovered there's some fine print we should have been paying attention to, as they finally did under Lehman. Well, then we could have gotten ready. People would have bought the fire extinguishers necessary. The next one wouldn't have been such a calamity. I was once at a hearing in the House, and Barney Frank said something very, very wise. He said, you know what? Nobody's ever going to believe us until we let one of these big things go. And I think that was the problem. Nobody ever believed them until one of them went.
But if I'm Geithner, maybe my counter would be like, well, hey, John, but we were dealing with a situation. Things were happening fast. And hey, look at our results. Our results are now stocks are at all-time highs. Housing markets come back. Things have stabilized. And, you could talk about moral hazards, but what moral hazard are you talking about?
Results. Actually, the economy is dismal if you look at it as economists do, the overall growth rate. But that has less to do with the financial crisis than all the other silly things the government's been doing since then. The result is we have this, ask anybody in finance how they like the Dodd-Frank setup. Ask anyone in finance if they think, this regulatory regime is going to work without strangling everything and is actually stopping us from the next crisis. Every past bailout, for a year or two afterwards, you could say, oh, wow, look, the bailout worked, the seas calmed, everything was done. Well, then, of course, another worse storm came. So really, you have to, we'll take the judgment on that. If 20 years go by and we have no crisis, then maybe, yes, fine, this time finally the magic worked. I doubt that's the case.
Let me shift gears on you. So the cost of regulation. And I think one of the interesting things that I see right now, and you've mentioned this in your work, is creators. In the tech field, for example, creators, government asking creators to come to us for bureaucratic permission. You must seek permission. And I think one of the interesting points you made was about Uber, the new driving service. Why don't you talk about that and contrast it with taxi service in America and contrast it with regulation? I mean, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. There's only one taxi service that leaves Washington Dulles. And when you get in that car, those guys are so angry and so bitter, and it's so regulated. It's so entirely nuts. But why don't you kind of talk about Uber and, the idea of going to permission for government to create and the idea that taxi service is already protected?
Well, what I found very interesting about Uber, so taxis, as you know, are a classic case of regulation that doesn't serve the consumer, that instead is there to keep competition out and keep prices up for the benefit of taxi drivers and taxi companies, really, who own the medallions. So how do we get rid of this kind of system? How does an economy like ours ever get out of that stranglehold? And years of little chipping away at the edges never worked because the taxi companies were so strongly related to the regulators. They'd so well captured the regulators. And this, of course, is a parable for lots and lots of regulated things in our economy. Well, Uber came in and by doing it, fell swoop very quickly, built up this customer base of people who really liked the service and who were willing to complain to their mayors and city councils when the taxi companies tried to take it back again. So the ability to come in and very swiftly get the alternative service going and create a political base of customers, which there wasn't before. There would be, who would complain about taxi medallions? Well, crazy libertarian economists and bloggers, but there wasn't a base of users ready to call up their alderman and say, stop this. And that's what I found very interesting about the politics of it. How can we ever get out of this stifling regulation? And the Uber model, technology seems to be able to do that by very swiftly and disruptively creating an alternative and then creating the base of political support to let that alternative survive.
I think when it comes to regulation in America, people often think of things like, well, we want a safe drinking water supply, a safe water supply. We have to worry about the traffic lights. We have to keep those running. And so then it's almost like that's used as cover to then have army of bureaucrats shuffling paper in D.C. on all kinds of regulation that is like literally nonsensical. So it's very clever that the regulation that we all know is like, hey, this is foundational. We need to have traffic lights, etc. But then it's just this expansionary government policy. Why don't you talk to that for a second? I think a lot of people sometimes don't recognize how dramatically at a disadvantage America is in many cases of the regulation. It's just over the top.
Yeah. Two comments. One, was it ever thus? Adam Smith railed about the guilds, and the way the guilds worked in the 1700s was in order to be in any business, you needed to be admitted to the guild, and the government would stop you from being in the business unless you're part of the guild. Of course, what this did was kept down competition, kept prices up, but was all defended in the public interest. We wouldn't want to have fly-by-night furniture makers foisting off bad furniture on the unsuspecting public, right? Of course, that's not what it did. Even now, the taxi regulation is a good example because it's in the news. People are aware of it. A lot of the public discussion is, the regulation has to be there to protect the poor taxi driver who can't make a decent living. We haven't yet, after 250 years, we haven't yet in the public discussion quite figured out that regulation is supposed to be there to help consumers, not to make a nice life for taxi drivers. Yeah, now where we're going in the U.S. what you said is exactly right. There's this perception of sort of the wise regulator on the mountain stopping someone from selling you shoddy products. When you think about your actual experience with goods, though, I mean, a Yelp review is restaurants give you good good service because they're terrified of a bad Yelp review, not because they're terrified of the regulator. That's the mechanism that gives you good service. And where regulation's heading in the U.S. is somewhere even darker, I think. Regulation, the perception is there's some rules. We say your traffic lights is a speed limit. There's a rule, 35 miles an hour, less than that, okay, greater than that, a ticket. The way regulation works now in the U.S. is there's just this 50,000-page vague set of rules, which the regulators can then do what they want to and haul you into court, and not even into court because you don't have the rights you would have into court, give you all sorts of fines, close down your business if you don't play along good and do what they say. So there's this nasty business, really, of trading political support for the permission of regulators to keep going about your business, as opposed to a clear set of rules with any sort of purpose to them. I was reading, in fact, so today's Wall Street Journal I was reading is on the lead editorial is Harry Reid's personal prosecutor about the FERC, and how it just decided to go after some poor guy who had a lumber mill. And they said there was no rule there. They just kind of made it up as they went along and went after this guy because they didn't like him. And that's the nature of regulation these days.
The sinister part for me is I think back to the opening scene of the first Godfather film, and you have to show up and pay respect to the man, and you have to offer all kinds of things to the man to get what you want. And it's I think for anybody out there that's got any entrepreneurial spirit, that it drives me crazy.
Well, that's a good model. I mean, let's think of a practical. I mean, imagine you're a bank. Could you, as a bank, or the CEO of a bank, do you think they would dare write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about all the deficiencies of Dodd-Frank and the silliness of the regulators? Or if you're a health insurance company, do you think you would dare write about the bad things that are going on in the ACA? Absolutely not. No, you go pay homage. Why? Because the regulator has this enormous discretionary power over what to do with you. Like the Godfather. There's no rules with the Godfather. There's no court. If the Godfather decides to burn down your business, you don't get to go to court and say, no, he didn't have the right to burn down my business. Well, that's the way things are going with regulation now.
Yeah, I'll go but I'm going to swing back on the end to healthcare and let you talk a little bit about that. But I think one of the things I saw in your work too that really struck me was the idea that commodities keep getting cheaper and cheaper. But people with expertise, that gets more and more expensive. And the comment that you said is, and I want you to answer it if you want to give it a shot, but what does the economy look like when goods are essentially free and all value consists of paying other people for their expertise? It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I meant it more as a question, and as a graduate students come in all the time and say, "What should I write my thesis about?" So it's a thesis question. I don't exactly have the answer there. It's one of those. You
just love being put on the spot on that heavy question, right?
Yeah. Well, here's a paper I'd like to write someday, but that does seem to me, what we do as economists is we're like abstract artists. We come up with some, not completely realistic, but some very, very clean parable about, how's the economy work that helps us to understand things. And that seems like an important one, this world where any object is free, but the expertise of course, how do you program the object, which is all human expertise. That expertise is expensive, but also that some of that expertise, like a doctor, has to be you and the doctor. Some of the other expertise can be embodied in an object that then goes all the way around the world. That's a lot of what the large increase in wealth at the top end comes from, is that now your human expertise can be sold for 10 cents a piece to everybody in the planet, and you get very rich.
I think one aspect as we talk about regulation that I think is interesting that probably most people don't think about is the idea of discretion. And discretion is terribly nefarious when there's no rules. I was involved in a court case where they basically were ruling what you could do to the outside of your house. And you would say, well, what color can I paint my house? They say, well, you tell us what color it's going to be, then we'll tell you if we like it. And you shake your head, you say, well, hold on, can't you give me the palette of colors ahead of time? And I thought it was interesting also, I saw in your blog, you're kind of talking about Fed policy. And, Fed policy is currently, here's what we think now, and we will want to do in the future, but we can change our minds at any time. And I think that also gets back to the power of discretion and the earlier regulatory examples in our conversation today. But discretion Why do more people not get up in arms about discretion? It's awful when government has discretion.
Well, because the problem is, of course, people have in mind, especially people on the left who want to be in this position, that this noble aristocracy who will wisely tell us what to do. And discretion has the advantage of you can't write down rules for everything ahead of time. So we all want to put in this sort of benevolent aristocrat who will do things right. But of course, nobody's smart enough. We got rid of aristocracy in this country for a reason. Rules are always equally frustrating because, the rule might say, oh, you must paint your house pink. And you say, but I don't want to paint my house pink. And then you have a big problem. But yeah, the problem with discretion is that it leads to corruption. When the rule maker can do whatever they want, then of course the rule maker can extract from you, in our country, more and more political support for the current administration in return for blessing what you do. And it's not just discretion, it's hidden, it's rules that are so maddeningly long and complicated and vague that nobody really knows what they mean. And that's what gives the actual discretion. So it looks like they're applying a rule, but they're not. In fact, the FERC case I was referring to is a good case in point. This guy running a paper mill got in trouble because he was taking advantage of a federal program that allows you to get money if you lower your electric bill. But over what baseline? Well, there was no rule about what the baseline was, so they're accusing him of manipulating the baseline, but of course there was no particular rules. But they just decided, we thought you manipulated the baseline, so hauled the guy in and basically closed down his business. There's a great example of discretion at work.
You've mentioned a couple of times in our conversation, you've made the comment from the left. But for example, if you were criticizing the right when it comes to overuse of government, overspending, where would you say the right, most in particular, the establishment in DC, where do they go overboard from a libertarian perspective and they're just as bad as the left when it comes to the spending and the misuse of dollars?
Yeah, during the Bush administration, that was not a great libertarian nirvana of cutting back the regulatory state. Things went on about as they were before, with only the worst part of they also like to use the government for social policy. Well, different kinds of social policy, I guess, because everyone's using the government for social policy. So we haven't seen, since Reagan really, anything in Washington that. We've heard voices for cut back this mess, but we haven't actually seen anybody cutting back this mess.
Let me end with a big picture subject that we can only spend a few minutes on, but healthcare. And as the son of a doctor who's had many thousands of patients, and to listen to his conversations, clearly my father never would have become a doctor in this day and age. It's something that the writing's on the wall. And he's been doing it for over 40 years. But how did we get to a point where maybe this isn't even the right question, but I'm just thinking the thought of we all know the experience of going into a DMV, right? We know that experience. We know who's running the DMV. We know it's not run like the Apple Store. We know it's not Apple Computer. We know there's something messed up about it. We all accept the fact that government workers often move at a different speed because they've got they can't be fired. They work for the government, that kind of thing. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, but it's the truth. We all know it. So how do we get to the point where we allow healthcare to go down this path? Yes, I get the idea that if one particular political party and a particular part of the population wants to give this benefit to people, but there's just no evidence the government, even the people that want healthcare, that can't afford healthcare, I don't think there's any evidence that they're actually going to get this product that they think they've been promised. And I'll leave with this thought too. I still remember driving through Riverside, California, and you would look up and you would see the billboards, and the billboards would tell you the best times to come to the emergency room. And, I don't think that's going to change.
Well, I think actually the DMV is a bad analogy. The DMV in Illinois works pretty well because the Secretary of State is directly elected by people. The post office is maybe a better analogy. I was actually there a while ago. There's a long line, and the lady closed her window and said, "I'm going on break," because, of course, it was time for her break, and the fact that there was a long line was irrelevant to her. But even that is not a good analogy. What we have done to healthcare in this country is not a straightforward, honest, government-provided, socialized system. Not something as well-functioning as the Veterans Affairs system, which, despite being in the news, is better functioning than what we put into place. We don't have a government-run system. What we have is this horribly complicated sort of crony capitalist system where the government is going to pay big insurance companies, and then the insurance companies are supposed to, follow this 50,000-page rule book, but of course everybody gets a waiver from the HHS so long as they keep their noses clean and don't complain too much in public. I think that system is far worse in the end than a sort of straightforward British or Scandinavian socialized system. It allows for much greater corruption. If you're actually spending public money, it may be inefficient, but there is some transparency. If what you've done is subcontract the whole thing out to 4 or 5 very large companies, and then try to write a rule book about how everybody does things, there's just much more opportunity for hiding skullduggery in the details, and for evading responsibility for the horrible kind of care that we're going to get. So unfortunately, it's worse than what you say.
Why is the idea of outrage? Is it just that people don't really think that there's a way to change anything anymore? It's you every 3 or 4 or 5 years or whatever, somebody gets elected. There's all kinds of promises that spirit of an election hits and everyone's excited, and then nothing changes.
I disagree with that. I think there's plenty of outrage. I mean, there is a Tea Party, and they grew up in the last election. They sort of seem to be fizzling around, but what has not really happened is anyone to harness the outrage and not ally it with some other kooky causes, which has happened in some places. But I think there's plenty of outrage. It's what's growing in the U.S. is a system designed to be a little bit under the cover. This system of greater and greater, not just regulatory. The administration is running things directly in more and more ways, and threatening you that if you don't support this, your business is going to get quashed. So these weeds are growing under, and people haven't really, haven't really seen that coming. The demise of rule of law is a fairly abstract concept for the average person to fight against. But there's plenty of outrage out there. It just hasn't yet organized itself in a way that produces a political majority, and let's hope it does.
Sounds good, sir. Hey, listen, I appreciate you taking the time today. Where's the best place for the audience to follow you?
So I have a webpage and I have a blog. So for popular issues, take a look at my blog, and an archive of everything I've ever done is on my webpage, and the best place to find me is by Googling me, John Cochrane.
John, I appreciate you taking the time today. Look forward to hopefully catching up in the future.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.